It's another live brought to you by me. Now, we're going to go over something today. Brendan Dassey was the main suspect in November. There wasn't this bullshit. Kayla went to the counselor act that got everything started with Brendan Dassey. Nah, this got started back in November. I'm going to break down some stuff to you. I'm going to show you why Brendan Dassey was the main suspect. Then I'm going to show you things at trial, during Brendan's trial, how they lie about the main suspect that Brendan was, and then they exclude a November 10th interview and then try to say that Brendan Dassey suggested all this stuff to Fassbender and Weigert. So let's get started, all right? Now, I'm on the notion that what we got going on here is premeditated, okay? You got 5 Dassey brothers. 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can all count. We know that Brendan has some limitations, okay? But we also have something going on prior to November, and that is, go back to July 2005. Electronic recording of custodial interviews is made mandatory, okay? Come November, the bill's passed. This is very, very critical that you understand electronic recording of custodial interviews in November of 2005, because some very big things are about to change. And when you learn how it's political and it's parallel with the investigation, you'll learn that everything's premeditated. So what I'm going to show you is a premeditated incident. See, you can't frame Steven Avery, okay? You can't frame Steven Avery without Brendan Dassey. I'll give you a perfect example of how they're using planted evidence along the way. First of all, November 9th, they arrest Steven Avery for felon in possession of a firearm, okay? But on November 6th, it states that they went into his room and they took the firearms out. But then if you go back on November 9th, when he's being arrested, you got them carrying out the firearms on TV. So whoever took them out on the 6th, they go back on the 9th. So the media can watch this retraction of the guns on the 9th. So they get the guns, they take them out on the 6th, but then they go and put them back in the house for news media, okay? So they're playing the viewers, the audience, Okay, and the whole thing that this electronic recording of custodial interviews is teaching you is the audience, the jury, the judge. So it's just goes to show you how things are being brought off Avery property and then brought back to the Avery property, and then they're putting cameras on it. Okay? So watch this. Watch what happens November 9th. Stephen Avery. He's arrested. Felon in possession of a firearm. Now what's very important about this is that firearm has not been linked to Teresa Hallback's death. It's not linked to the death of Teresa Hallback. They go ahead and they arrest him on the charge just to put him in custody in case he wants to run. He won't be charged with intentional homicide until the 15th. First degree intentional homicide doesn't come for 6 days later. So, what I find really funny, you can go back on Making a Murderer, Season 1, Episode 5, and they're talking about Brendan Dassey's confession and how after Brendan Dassey's confession, they charged Stephen Avery with kidnapping and sexual assault. Okay? Because of Dassey's confession. But the state says in order to discuss those in Stephen Avery's trial, the state is going to have to call Brendan Dassey because it was Brendan Dassey's confession that got Stephen charged with sexual assault and kidnapping. So the state says, okay, we're not going to go forward with these charges. We're going to drop them against Stephen Avery because we don't want to call Brendan Dassey on the stand. But yet, they go ahead and on March 1st, a couple of days after Brendan's confession on March 1st, I think it's like the 6th, they might even be earlier than that, they amend Stephen Avery's charges and link the felon in possession of firearm to Teresa's death because now we have her being shot in the head. Bang, 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 okay? And this is important because now they got first intentional homicide from November 15th being linked to the firearm, but it's Brendan Dassey's confession linking it. They use the firearm as the main cause of death when they're showing the skull fragments and the entry wounds, and they're pointing it out on the Alamo, but yet it's Brendan Dassey's confession that linked Stephen Avery to that firearm. So how do you drop the sexual assault and how do you drop the kidnapping, but you link the firearm, but you still don't put Brendan Dassey on the stand in Stephen Avery's case? Now, the thing that's always bothered me is Brendan Dassey was never called as the state. You want to do that if you're the state, you don't want Brendan Dassey anywhere near that witness stand as if you're the state, because the evidence does not add up to Brendan's confession. So what you're doing, you're splitting them as co-defendants, you're convicting Stephen Avery on circumstantial evidence, like Judge Patrick Willis says. He says, even though we have the biggest forensic evidence case in the state of Wisconsin that Wisconsin's ever seen, everything is largely circumstantial. Okay, over 970 pieces of items with evidentiary value that they claim was tested, but yet at the closing arguments in his sentencing, the judge sits there and tells Stephen Avery that, oh, it's circumstantial, largely circumstantial. Okay, so that's what they're convicting Stephen on, and then they want to convict Brendan over here on his confession and his confessions alone. And they do use little pieces of evidence, but it's just absurd because in Brendan's trial, they already established in Stephen's trial that item FL was contaminated, the bullet fragment, and it's even dumbed down even more in Brendan's trial. But the main focus here is not what happened February 27th, February 28th, and March 1st of 2006, when Brendan's interrogated for 3 days and he gives the confession on the third day. What is important for you as a supporter to understand is that Brendan was being targeted to be used as a main suspect in early November. And I'm going to prove this to you. Okay? So, and this is what you got to understand, that everything that happens in November runs parallel with the political realm of what's going on in Madison. But they have to abort using Brendan Dassey because Brendan Dassey is a minor. And they have to abort it because at the time that legislation goes into effect, when the bill gets signed off on, no law enforcement can interview Brendan Dassey again until they've had special training on the interviewing of custodials, on custodial interviews, minors. So basically before Weigert and Brendan, or before Weigert and Fassbender interviewed Brendan, you got a 4 months delay from November to March. And it's because of that bill. I want to pull something up. So I have to pull something up real quick to share with you that's happened politically. Now, November, we have Brendan. They literally just step away from interrogating him. But then in February 23rd, we got these meetings going on in Madison with the Nelson technique. Okay, and the Nelson technique talks about softening police presence. It talks about not playing good cop, bad cop, but establishing a friendship with the suspect. And this is February 23rd, right before they start interviewing Brendan on the 27th of February, 4 days earlier. And we see everything in Neil Nelson that they're describing happened to Brendan Dassey. You will not find any other read technique where they don't play good cop, bad cop, okay, and they don't do a 2-hour interview and stop and come back the next day, do a 2-hour interview, come back the next day, stuff like that. So let's go back to November real quick. Brendan Dassey. There's two main things that happened to Brendan Dassey that put him on the suspect list. Now, he's in Marinette County Sheriff's Office detective's car, Anthony O'Neill. Kim Skorlinski's out there, Baldwin's out there, Deb Strauss is out there. Steven had sent Brian and Brendan to a store for soda. They have a warrant to seize the Grand Dam, okay, to seize Steven's car and the flatbed. And so Brian and Brendan get in Steven's Grand Dam. They drive his Pontiac just a bit up the road. They pull him over thinking that it's Steven, but it's actually Brian and Brendan in the car. Okay, so Deb Strauss and Skorlinski put Brian Dassey in the back of a car and they interview him. And his interview is 10 minutes. And it's in this interview that we learn that Brian tells Deb Strauss that Bobby said that he watched Teresa Hallback leave. And so Zellner brought that up in a brief, okay? But then Bobby has said that he watched Teresa walk towards Steven's trailer. Now, Bobby never says that he watched Teresa go into Steven's trailer. But Brendan Dassey is in a car with O'Neill and Baldwin, and O'Neill's getting in and out. He's talking back and forth with Skorlinski, and he's got a dossier on what's happened the day before, November 5th, and here we are, November 6th, and the RAV4 has been found, and they're wanting Marinette County to get involved and go interview people in Crivets at the Avery property, and they're wanting to serve a warrant for that flatbed and for Steven's Pontiac Grand Dam. Now, so they pull Brian and Brendan over. Brendan Dassey's in the back of O'Neill's car, all right? And Brendan talks about how he gets off the bus and he sees Teresa talking to Steven, and him and Blaine go inside and they're looking out the window and they're like, they want to know how much, they're going to make off the car or whatever. Brendan's asked the question, and Brendan is the first person who says he watched Teresa go inside of Steven's trailer. So Brendan's statement is even more damaging than Bobby's statement, okay? Because Brendan Dassey actually puts Teresa Hall back going into Steven's trailer. He says that he witnesses it. Okay, Bobby didn't say that Teresa went into Steven's trailer. Bobby says he saw her walking in that direction. Brendan Dassey, who says that she went to the trailer. And then Brendan offers something up that's never been heard before on either side. And Brendan goes, "Do you think he did it?" And O'Neill says, "Did what?" And Brendan says, "Do you think that Steven raped her?" And nobody has this inclination of rape at all at this point. So Brian gets about a 10-minute interview, and Brendan's interview goes on for a little over an hour. Okay? And he starts sweating. He's not doing normal things. This is how O'Neill is reading his body language, and O'Neill says that his body language and the way he's answering was highly suspect. Okay, and so we had two things that have happened. We have Brendan Dassey said he saw Teresa go into Steven's house, and then he says, "Do you think he done it?" Did what? You think he raped Teresa? So they're going back and forth with information that hasn't been divulged yet. Okay? So Brendan gets on the radar. O'Neill comes back and he does a presumptive questioning where he goes, "Brendan, a lot of people don't know this, but need to know this, and that's that Teresa Hallback takes medicine and she needs her medicine, and we would like to get that medicine to her, and do you know where she is?" So takes from a normal interview that should have been 10 minutes, like Brian Dassey's, and it goes on for an hour, and they're giving Brendan loaded questions as he's a suspect. Okay? Come 4 days later on November 10th, they bring a warrant to get Alan Avery's DNA, and Skorlinski is there to help serve that warrant, and he comes and he speaks with Brendan. He's like, "Hey, Brendan, do you remember me from the car the other night?" And Brendan's like, "Yeah." And so now we have Skorlinski doing an interview with Brendan Dassey. And, he talks about the garage, he talks about this, that, and this is everything that's damaging in this case, because the November 10th interview, Skorlinski tells Brendan what he thinks happened. And he's like, "Brendan, now is not the time to be lying for Uncle Steven. We know that you know stuff that's happened, and Steven's basically going to take you down with him." And this is being all computed and factored in on November 10th. Well, that November 10th interview is suppressed at Brendan's trial. Okay? Instead of calling Skorlinski to trial, they call Anthony O'Neill to trial to talk about November 6th. November 10th never brings it, never is it brought up. It never brings any of the suggestiveness to Brendan Dassey into court. And that's what's so absurd about this, because even Even Weigert and Drizin suppressed this evidence. Later on in Brendan Dassey's post-conviction appeals. So Fassbender and Weigert would have the state of Wisconsin believe that Brendan Dassey suggested all this stuff from the 27th to 28th and on March 1st. And Brendan was the very first person to make the suggestive evidence. When in fact, on November 10th, it's Kim Skorlinski that suggests all this to Brendan. November 10th, okay, 4 months prior. And that's because November 6th, 4 days before November 10th, Brendan is seen as a total suspect for saying, do you think he raped her? And I saw Teresa go into Steven's trailer. That information was never divulged by anybody, not even by Bobby Dassey. Bobby Dassey says, I saw Teresa walk towards his trailer. Brendan Dassey says, I saw Teresa go inside the trailer. Now what happens November 15th? Weigert has processed this information from O'Neill and Skorlinski on the 6th and the 10th of November. And on November 15th, Mark Weigert, November 15th, 2005, takes out a warrant for Stephen Avery's computer for pornography, torture, death. And he says that these would be the motive for Stephen Avery to kill Teresa. And Jerry Poggles is talking about accomplices that we are not going to reveal at this time. So there's an accomplice on November 15th that they're suspecting, and with Brendan Dassey, the only one suggesting rape on November 6th, and Brendan Dassey was at the bonfire, Brendan Dassey is a main suspect. Okay? So what do they do with this information November 15th? They have to back off from bringing Brendan Dassey into the picture because the political realm, what's happening in Madison is now, before you can interview a child anymore, you have to have credited hours, you have to have custodial interrogation training for all juveniles. So Brendan is off the hook for 4 months now. They don't come back to Brendan into 4 months later because by law, Brendan is absolutely untouchable until law enforcement has to train him. So, I'm going to put it into perspective like this. Brendan Dassey, he's coerced March 1st. It's not until a month and 20 days later, on April 21st, they go get the Dassey Yonda computer hard drive from the Yonda residence. Okay? And there's a forensic analysis, but Fassbender sits on the CD for 13 years. In hindsight, it's 2020. They're like, oh, that belongs to Bobby. That belongs to Bobby. That belongs to Bobby. Go back to November 15th. Weigert took a warrant out and said he's searching Stephen Avery's hard drive for pornography, torture, rape, and death. Okay? November 15th. And what is Brendan Dassey's coerced involvement? Pornography, torture, rape, and death. Brendan suggested rape on as early as November 6th. So this stuff wasn't ever found on Stephen Avery's hard drive, but it said it's suspected to be found on Stephen Avery's hard drive, November 10th. So here we are, 5 months later, and Fassbender takes this CD and sits on it for 13 years because that hard drive's planted. That shit doesn't go to Bobby Dassey. That shit was planted. They were going to bring Brendan Dassey in November. Their idea was November 15th. But by the grace of God, Brendan becomes untouchable by a bill. You cannot interview a juvenile until you've had adequate training as an investigator on custodial interrogations. The irony of that, right? So, brings you back to February 23rd, 4 days before they start interviewing Brendan Dassey. Jerry Buting, Steven Drizin, Director of Training Bureau, Department of Justice, Ken Hammond, and a couple other people, even Joseph Buckley from the Reed Technique is at this seminar in Madding. It's a Criminal Justice Study Commission meeting, okay? Ken Hammond gets up and he starts reading over the Neil Nelson's technique, okay? He's reading over it. He hands out paperwork to everybody. Laura Riccardi and Maura are at this seminar and they're actually filming it. It's on film. This is 4 days before Brendan Dassey even begins the interrogation of him. And so Ken Hammond is talking about Attorney General Peg Lautenschlager and how she come up with this model policy on the recording of juveniles, okay? And these seminar classes that have been being done since early December, seminar classes that Mark Weigert and Tom Fassbender took. And Ken Hammond is talking about how to soften your police presence. Everything you do on video is for the audience, which the audience is the judge and the jury, and everything you do is going to be memorialized forever. So Weigert and Fassbender, they don't do Reed technique. Reed techniques play good cop, bad cop. You see both of these people come in there. Fassbender tells Brendan, I'm a father, Brendan. I have a son your age. Let me help you. Weigert is playing good cop right along with Fassbender. They're softening their police presence, and the whole Nelson technique is to have respect for the anxiety of the suspect. Okay? Neil Nelson would rather have you go in, talk to the suspect as friendly as possible, take a break, learn from it, come back the next day, do another couple hours, take a break, come back the next day. Stay friendly. Have a good rapport. Okay? This is what we see with Brendan Dassey. We don't see the Reed technique happen with Brendan. And so Jerry Buting and Steven Drizin get these handouts. They get the handouts during this Criminal Justice Study Commission. 4 days later, the model policy that Attorney General Lautenschlager wanted the state of Wisconsin to use was Nelson's technique, because it makes the cops look good on camera. It's to protect the cops. It's the best way to protect them. So keep in mind that whatever they want to say that Kayla Avery said to a counselor or whatever, they already pegged Brendan as an accomplice in early November. But this bill protected Brendan. So here we are in a trial. Fast forward, 2007. They're using O'Neill on the stand. Okay, and O'Neill says that Brendan Dassey's body language is suspect, and he brought up rape. Okay, and he's the person who says, hey, I watched Teresa go into my Uncle Steven's house. So 4 days later, November 10th, Skorlinski comes back. I know you know something, Brendan. Now is not the time to be lying for Uncle Steven. Teresa was murdered and burned right here in this pit. And we know you saw a body part. He's asking about the garage. See, everything that Skorlinski suggests November 10th, the state wants to say that Brendan Dassey suggested it the 27th, 28th, and March 1st. But they tell Brendan, tell us what you think we already know. And what Brendan thinks they already know is what Skorlinski goes in and tells them. Okay? It becomes pornography, torture, rape, death, bondage. November 15th. They suspect to find that on Steven's hard drive. Okay? Whatever they had planted with all that to use, Fassbender makes an attempt to go get the Dassey computer a month and 20 days later, because they're like, shit, we really can't use that now because we blew the whistle too early and this damn bill kept us from interviewing Brendan. That's why Fassbender sits on that CD for 13 years. This is exactly why he sits on the CD for 13 years. They couldn't use it because they were going to bring Brendan in as an accomplice in November. But the bill protects them until law enforcement has adequate training on custodial interviews. That doesn't wrap up for Weigert and Fassbender until February, end of February. And on a phone conversation that I had with Neil Nelson myself, Neil Nelson says he remembers those investigators approaching him and asking him for techniques. Now Nelson was in Madison training people, okay? And what else I found very absurd is that Steven Drizin, with all his experience, he helps the Supreme Court in July 2005 make a decision in the Jarrell's case that Wisconsin is going to start mandating the recording of juveniles, okay? And Jerry Buting recommends that they call in these expert witnesses, and Jerry Buting reaches out to Steven Drizin, reaches out to Joseph Buckley of the Reed Institution, and he gets them to start coming out to these meetings, okay? And yet, Jerry Buting knows that Neil Nelson was the Attorney General's model policy technique that was wanted to be used, but yet Steven Drizin doesn't show up pro bono for Brendan Dassey, but yet this is the pinnacle of the movement for recording juveniles in Wisconsin. This is kind of like Steven Drizin's baby here. It's Jerry Buting's baby. There's very two political, deep state affiliated political attorneys, but no one says, hey, Neil Nelson was used on Brendan Dassey, not Reed technique, okay? None of them blow the whistle on the Attorney General's policy on what technique was used on Brendan. It was Neil Nelson. So Steven Drizin doesn't do a pro bono case for Brendan. He should have took a pro bono case. If Jerry Buting is getting Steven Drizin to come talk to the Criminal Justice Study Commission because he's the best expert in the region, okay? But then doesn't even reach out to him 4 days later when they coerce Brendan. There's a problem with that. And both Jerry and Drizin firmly know about the Neil Nelson technique. They've been going around with Ken Hammond giving out handouts from the Attorney General. Bipartisan groups help train at the law enforcement seminars. That means your defense attorneys sat down with the cops and said, hey, this is what we see and this is what we need to be seen. But no one ever blows a whistle on Neil Nelson. Jerry Buting never contacts Steven Drizin 4 days later from that February 23rd Criminal Justice Study Commission. Never gives Steven Drizin as an expert witness, and Steven Drizin never does Brendan's case pro bono. But Brendan Dassey is the first child in the state of Wisconsin to have a coerced confession on interview. So you would think that that would be monitored by Steven Drizin, Jerry Buting, and anybody else who's working with Madison to stop these wrongful convictions this way. You would think that Steven Drizin would assert himself and say, hey, I've been studying these false confession cases for the past 7-8 years, and he knew he worked with Keith Finley. Him and Keith Finley filed a brief in the Jarrell's case in December of 2004, which by the time July 2005 rolled around, when Wisconsin Supreme Court makes it mandated to record juveniles, Keith Finley and Steven Drizin were a big part of that. Okay, so Steven Drizin, he knew who Stephen Avery was because he worked with the Wisconsin Innocence Project. So when you got Stephen Avery's nephew being the first kid to be screwed around so bad on a false confession and this coercion, and Steven Drizin does not take that pro bono, there's a problem with that. Okay? So what does Steven Drizin do? Brendan's convicted. You got Laura Nyrider, who's brand new with the Northwestern Innocent Project. And Steven Drizin takes her as a Dassey file and says, hey, learn everything you can about the Reed technique. But both Jerry Buting and Steven Drizin know for a fact that Weigert and Fassbender didn't interrogate Brendan Dassey under Reed. He interrogated them under the Nelson, okay? Under Neil Nelson's approach. And so Steven Drizin gives the Dassey file to Laura, who's, she's green as a pasture. She's green as the day she's born. And she doesn't know a lot. So if you're Steven Drizin and you got this access to all these attorneys to do free work on Brendan's case, and you're Steven Drizin and you've known about false confessions for a while, you would expect for Steven Drizin to give that Dassey file and call in 3 of the best attorneys in that Northwestern University innocent project right there and say, hey, we need to help this kid. You would expect him to be giving that file to 3 of the top attorneys in that group, not the layman Laura Nyrider. And you would expect for Steven Drizin to say, hey, the AG's model policy is Neil Nelson, is Softon's police present. This wasn't done under Reed. This was done under Nelson. We got to show premeditation here. But Drizin doesn't do that. Drizin suppresses the November 10th interview. Okay? Nobody blows a whistle on the electronic recording of custodial interrogations. But yet, Jerry Buting was responsible in the Criminal Justice Study Commission for helping to get the expert witnesses out there. Okay? And electronic recording was Jerry Buting's baby. So I got a couple of my friends who follow my research intensely because I help connect dots in the political realm, okay? And so I get one of my friends to message Jerry Buting, and I get another friend to message Jerry Buting, and I get another friend to message Jerry Buting, and I get them to pose the question through Facebook, hey Jerry, what is Nelson technique? And Jerry responds back with, you mean the Reed technique? So Jerry's trying to dumb it down, okay? And I hit a nerve with Jerry Buting that finally, after my book was published in 2017, and he didn't want to answer any questions, took 2018, 19, 20, 21, 4.5 years later, he sends me an email. He's like, here, Chad, this is the reason I don't answer your questions. Well, if you're running from very pertinent questions on stuff like who is Neil Nelson, and weren't you helping to teach law enforcement the Attorney General's model policy on Neil Nelson? And he was, because it was a bipartisan group effort for everybody working with Madison in a political realm to band together and strengthen electronic recordings to protect juveniles like Brendan Dassey. And Brendan Dassey is the first juvenile that's recorded, okay? The first. And we have all of these political attorneys as expert witnesses in Madison helping in these Democratic bipartisan commissions, yet there's a major F-up with what goes wrong with Brendan Dassey, but yet you have Drizin and Buting and Finley, who are the experts on this, But no one blows a whistle to the Attorney General's office on Fassbender and Weigert's conduct. But yet, Jerry Buting, the chair over the Wisconsin State Bar Criminal Law Section, ceded to the Criminal Justice Study Commission, the criminal law section, okay, who was so instrumental in expert witnessing and whistleblowing on false confessions of juveniles, that even though he's on a commission with Peg Lautenschlager, he still doesn't go knock on her door and say, "Hey, Peg, we got a problem here." And see what my problem here is, Jerry. Little butthole, little sphincter's probably going squeak, squeak, squeak when you watch this. My problem with you, Jerry, is that you watched Ken Kratz's March 2nd press conference in 2006 in Dean Strang's office on Brendan Dassey. Well, the truth about that, Dean Strang's office at that time was in Madison, right across the street from Peg Lautenschlager's Attorney General office. Jerry Buting states in his book, The Illusion of Justice, which very much so, very ironic, Jerry. The illusions of justice. You are the very epitome of illusions of justice. You state in your book that you're in Dean Strang's office, you're watching the March 2nd press conference unfold. Attorney General Lautenschlager's office is across the street, okay? You're on a commission with her that says electronic recordings will not be a part of wrongful convictions, but yet you never walk across the street, knock on her door and say, "Hey, Peg, we got a major problem here." You never do it. Steven Drizin doesn't do it. Keith Finley doesn't do it. But y'all are political attorneys. 25,000 attorneys, prosecutors, and judges that hold a state bar license in Wisconsin in 2005. But there's only a handful of people working with these commission groups, and there's prosecutors, senators, sheriffs, law enforcement, Department of Justice, state crime lab personnel, like the whole ball of wax that the Department of Justice is, okay? And you're seated on these commission with like 20 other people, Jerry, and all these other people say, "Hey, Stephen Avery's guilty," but you're the only one that's stating his innocence. Yet you get to remain on the commission when the charter statement released August 31st of 2005, the charter statement for the Criminal Justice Study Commission said that, Stephen Avery, the Criminal Justice Study Commission is picking up where Stephen Avery Task Force left off, but we're not going to point fingers at Manitowoc County. That's not what we're here to do, and we urge our members to not do that. But yet, 6 months later, in February, you start pointing fingers at Manitowoc County, and you're on the commission handpicked by Attorney General Lautenschlager that, as a member, you're not supposed to be pointing fingers at Manitowoc County. So there's a lot of discrepancies. And yeah, Jerry, you're not friends with Lautenschlager. She never attended one of the Criminal Justice Study Commissions. She kind of blew off the Avery Task Force because Representative Mark Gundrum, she figured, as you told me in the email, was going to plot against her and use whatever to run against her as an Attorney General. Gundrum was going to run as Attorney General. This is what Buting told me. So she distanced herself. But the fact is, Jerry had a direct link to Lautenschlager. And on June 3rd, 2005, Lautenschlager in the WildNet, Wisconsin Law Enforcement Network Bulletin, the WildNet Bulletin, Lautenschlager releases a statement that said, jailhouse snitching, contaminated DNA, tunnel vision, crimes of statute, offenses, and that's like sexual assault cases. How long later can you do a sexual assault on? And then your electronic recording would not be factors of wrongful convictions. Peg Lautenschlager releases this June 3rd, 2005. This is 5 months before Teresa's even reported missing. Jerry Buting is a seated member of this commission. All these issues that I just named become a part of Stephen Avery's investigation, a part of this trial. Jerry Buting is the lead expert on these, including electronic monitoring, of juveniles giving false confessions. He doesn't blow a whistle. Get the hell out of here, man. Get the hell out of here. And then only when Making a Murderer, you get 19 million views in the first month when it airs on Netflix. Come around February 2016, Cherry and Dean start going on these tours for criminal reforms. Now, why weren't you going on tours for criminal reforms back in 2007 when Stephen Avery was convicted? Okay? Who else goes on tours in 2016? Well, Mark Weigert and Tom Fassbender start doing tours specifically for Associated Press and law enforcement venues to dumb down everything about making a murderer. See, you call it what it is, but it boils down to a conflict of interest in a political scandal. It is one of the largest political scandals in the United States of America. And it involved the bad apples of every Department of Justice office, crime state lab, defense attorneys, public defender's office, sheriff's office, Division of Criminal Investigations, all your whole ball of wax that the Wisconsin Department of Justice is set on this Criminal Justice Study Commission, and they set on this Avery Task Force, and they premeditated Stephen Avery's frame job. You don't have a murder. You do not have a murder on Avery Road. You have a frame job, okay? And until Kathleen Zellner files this and blows a whistle, nobody's going home. So that's where we gotta get the record straight. Brendan did not make a suggestion to Mark Weigert and Thomas Fassbender February 27th, February 28th, March 1st of 2006. On November 10th, the Division of Criminal Investigations made the suggestion that Brendan was involved, okay? Then they try to hide it during the trial. And that's where and what everybody needs to be aware of. It's not a read technique that they're getting this confession out with. It's Neil Nelson's technique that they're doing this confession with. So hopefully tonight I'm able to educate you. If you watch this video, keep in mind, you got to go beyond Avery Road. This is one of America's largest political scandal in the state of the United States of America. Happened right in Wisconsin. Believe it. Believe it, believe it, believe it.